Creating and shaping policies is about guiding society towards a better future. It's the science, art and discipline of understanding the issues of today with the foresight of tomorrow to bring creative ideas as measured practical steps to an optimal destination. Dr. Kaushik Basu is an Indian economist who was the chief economist of the World Bank from 2012 to 2016. He is the Karl Marx Professor of International Studies and Professor of Economics at Cornell University. And from 2009 to 2012, Dr. Basu served as the chief economic advisor to the government of India. And we speak to him today on his latest book, Policymakers Journal, From New Delhi to Washington, D.C. It's a memoir of his years as he transitioned from academics to policy and back. It takes us behind closed doors of meetings where some of the most important decisions are made and also to very extravagant locations in the world of policy. It's personal, profound, and it has a hilarious narrative that keeps readers engaged in the world of policy. Thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Basu. How are you today?
Thank you very much, Suyong. It's a pleasure to join. I'm doing fine, and I hope you're well.
And well, congratulations on your new book. It came out earlier this month, and well, I had the privilege of being able to read it. And well, first, I'd love to know how your new book came to be and what really inspired you to turn your diaries into a book, and also, of course, what you hope to convey to your readers.
Yeah. So there were two things really. First of all, the keeping of the diary. I'm not a diary keeper normally, but when I joined the government of India as the chief economic advisor, it was such a dramatically different experience for me from my life in the university, teaching, writing papers, doing research, that it took me some time to adjust to the new world. And one form of adjustment, almost therapy, was every evening to write down notes of my day's unusual experience. So the diary writing began almost as therapy to cope with my new world. It was much after I did 3 years in the government of India, 4 years I worked with the World Bank, and well after that, I thought maybe it's not just a personal account. There is something of value for the larger society to get a bit of a glimpse of decision-making, policy-making, at the top that takes place in a government like India and also in an international organization like the World Bank, which has an impact around the world. So I allowed some time to pass because you did not want to talk about the inside story just after leaving. And now that it is a bit of history, my publishers were very keen that I come in. And so I worked on it just to polish up and get the book going and moving. And thank you very much that you've read it.
And well, it's so fascinating, really, just seeing all these names that we're used to seeing in newspapers actually interact and sort of seeing a humane side to them and also how these policies come about. And it seems like it was a very stressful job as well as a very exciting one. I suppose you were constantly on Air India, just flying all over the world, constantly on call. And well, your book, I think it also comes at a very important time because it reminds us how there needs to be an element of humanity as well as rationality behind the numbers and the calculations in policymaking, especially at a time of this pandemic. And right now, as we talk about economic recovery from the COVID-19 virus, the biggest focus seems to be on GDP growth projections and the stock market. Would you say that is the right approach?
The focus on GDP is a very important focus, and I will elaborate on that a little bit. The stock market is important as an instrument. It tells you something else about the larger economy, so you cannot ignore the stock market. But our ultimate aim is GDP, and not just GDP. It's the distribution of GDP. And I have to say, I mean, I derive some consolation from your country stressing that, you know, it is the larger goodness, welfare, well-being in society that you're after. And GDP is a component of that. And the reason why today it is a dramatic reminder because of the pandemic is we are seeing a very strange pattern of coming out of the deep recession that most countries are caught in. The top segment of most countries, it's improving, people are becoming better off. The bottom segment is actually getting worse. So even if overall GDP begins to climb, we have to be sensitive to what's happening to the lower middle classes, to the poor, and in most places in the world from where we are getting data, it is showing up that the COVID has had a very strange effect on the economy. It has affected everyone, but the top segment has not done too badly. In fact, some of them have actually gained, whereas the bottom across the world has been hurt. So yes, you have to watch the GDP, you have to watch the stock markets, but we must not forget that our ultimate concern has to be for the segment that needs the government, needs the help. That has to be the focus. And those are instruments for that larger target.
And well, you mentioned South Korea, and of course, South Korea made the transition from a developing economy to a developed one earlier this month at the UN Conference on Trade and Development. You actually handpicked South Korea as the safest pick for the country that's for countries that are most likely to be the biggest success over the next decade. What do you think has enabled South Korea to actually come to this point? And do you think it could also improve the quality as well as the quantity of economic growth?
Let me preface that a little bit. It was a bit of a fun article when you speculate about the future of the world. I was doing in the middle of the pandemic. In fact, when I was living in lockdown, I was trying to speculate about which countries could come out on top. And I felt that the best bet is on South Korea, which has great prospects. And I will tell you the reason for that. One of them is that South Korea has stressed what is, I feel, in today's new world especially, is going to be the most important part of recovery, which is education, higher education, creativity. South Korea has been putting a lot of stress on that, and this goes back for a while, and I can give you one piece of number. If you look at patents, intellectual property being created, per capita, keep the population divided by the population, we keep hearing about patents activity is very high in the United States, in Israel, in South Korea, Japan. But actually, if you look at the statistics, the world leader now per capita is South Korea. Largest number of patents coming out in South Korea, quite a bit of drop for the second country, Japan. Third, fourth is almost a tie between China and USA, then Israel, then other countries. So South Korea is doing very well in this intellectual space, which I think, thanks to the pandemic and thanks also to the progress of technology, increasingly the mechanical part of work is going to be taken over by machines. So countries that can get into the space of creative work will do well and better. That's there, and there's the other thing that I should tell you, that education, the importance on education, South Korea has given a lot of that emphasis. I don't think this was done deliberately. It's probably a bit of a cultural thing in South Korea. But we do know that very often the mathematics school teacher in South Korea is a celebrated character, the way a rock star is in another country or a businessman is in another country. And I believe that there's something right in it. And I should point to a third thing. I am a bit partial to your president, Moon Jae-in. I feel he is actually one of the better presidents in the world, in the sense he has progressive, realistic ideas, but also a certain humanism with his ideas. And I like the fact that he has worked on raising the minimum wage. He has worked on curbing the number of hours laborers work. I like the fact that he's made gestures towards North Korea, because South Korea has a risk, which is the political risk. It is in a zone which is a very troubled zone. But given the progressive, humanistic policies which Moon Jae-in from 2017 has been pushing. So overall, all these things made me feel that maybe South Korea has the best chance. But this is looking into the future, and there are uncertainties that every country has to deal with. So no one can be certain. But if I had to take a bet, I would do that. That's what I had written once, and I think you're referring to my little op-ed that I had written some months ago.
Well, there's certainly a great amount of attention on South Korea as well as being part of the wider Indo-Pacific area due to the increasing sort of geopolitical and economic complications surrounding the rivalry between the United States and China. Do you see any areas of partnership or collaboration that could take place between India and South Korea, for instance, to overcome this sort of uncertainty?
I think there's scope for a lot, really. And over time, I have not followed this closely in recent times. India-South Korea interactions were improving steadily. Manufacturing, certain kinds of production taking place in India. And also I have to tell you, South Korean restaurants, which were earlier unheard of in India, no one knew about them. Suddenly you're seeing them cropping up in different places. That's just, of course, a form of the increasing interaction. I believe that both countries, being market economies, basically allowing for space for market, but being aware that ultimately the government's responsibility is towards the people who are more disadvantaged. So market economy with a progressive viewpoint gives a certain commonness. And if that can be used, I feel there's scope for great partnership. It could be a cluster of countries, but South Korea and India has scope for taking this much further forward with mutual benefits, because in terms of per capita income, wages, India is much behind South Korea. So there's scope for trade. There are different advantages. And as we economists say, comparative advantages. Are there different kinds of comparative advantages? So there's scope for collaboration between the two countries, big time.
And well, across the world, really, many were hoping to see more cooperation on sharing vaccines around the world. And, well, it's clear that a lot of developing countries and economies are being left behind. And drug developers, they've been opposed to waiving patents on vaccines, saying that it would discourage innovation. And some say that developing countries lack sufficient facilities to produce them anyway. But what do you think about these arguments? Do you think it's acceptable to really rationalize self-interest over vaccine patents?
Suyang, this is one matter where we have to be a bit careful. No, you don't want self-interest to be dominant, but we also have to be aware that that's the way the world is. There's a lot of self-interest at play. So you can't go in with a policy intervention where you will damage the incentive of some sectors. So my own belief is the patent system for now has to continue. You cannot put an end to the patent system. However, we can have emergencies like the pandemic today and take a very, very specific decision that given the worldwide pandemic situation, we are removing patents for the next 2 years. But it's a very special situation. We are not going to do this regularly because if you remove the patent system altogether, the development of drugs, a lot of it is driven by self-interest. But self-interest is a part of life. I wish people were not like that, but given that people are like that, you cannot just suddenly remove that. So you have to do that. But one more thing which is possible to do even now, without removing the patents, is allow the manufacture of these new drugs in developing countries. They can be manufactured in Africa for use in Africa. That is not going to cut into the profits of the big pharmaceutical companies, because these drugs produced in Africa, they cannot be sold in Europe, cannot be sold in the United States. That can be a law that you can't sell this back. We do that with many products. A book is produced, ordinary book that I've written, can be produced for the developing country market, be sold cheap so that people can buy there, but that cheap book cannot be sold in the United States. We can begin to take steps of this kind, and I think that's absolutely crucial. Overall patent system can't go just now, but we can take emergency measures that given what the pandemic situation is right now, we are taking a step that right now for coronavirus, for COVID-19, the patent is being removed, people can produce and people can begin to use. So, but that has to be an emergency one-time measure so that people know that you're not going in for this as a general rule, so that drug production should not stop because the incentive has suddenly gone out of the pharmaceutical sector. It's a very difficult task, but we have to be realistic with the good, noble aims in mind and devise policies.
And really, well, it's certainly a complex situation, and policies are the ways to help us get out of them, really, and create an optimal solution. And it was fascinating how there was just this creativity in your book when reading about how you were forming these policies and how it seems more of an art, really, bringing really that creativity as well as the rationality. And among the policies that you designed, Are there any that you are most proud of or found memorable?
Well, I can tell you some. iDesign is putting it too strongly. I mean, I was one of the players. But for instance, spectrum auction. Indian government was going to sell 3G spectrum on the market. The traditional way in India would do this is that government officials would sit down, work out the value of it, and then sell it. Usually you underestimate the value. I was pushing very hard that we should instead go for an auction system. And you know, in economics, auction design is a very sophisticated subject. It is almost like engineering. Auctions can be designed. And the Indian government did that. And actually through the spectrum auction, the government picked up much more money, double what we would have done if we had done it the usual way, we calculate and give it out. But I can tell you one more idea, which I think was a novel idea. I pushed for it, but it never got accepted. It was politically too difficult. Corruption and corruption control. Bribery, which is dreadful. In India, Indian law, and I don't know the Korean law, but I'm pretty sure it will be the same law because most countries have that when there is an incidence of bribery, the bribe giver and the bribe taker are both punished equally. I had argued that what happens in India is after someone gives a bribe, after giving the bribe, you hate it when you have to give the bribe, but after giving the bribe, you collude to keep it a secret because you will get into trouble. So I had said India's bribery law should be amended where the giving of a bribe should not be treated as a criminal activity. Taking of a bribe by a government servant is a criminal activity. If you do that, if I'm forced to give a bribe, maybe I'll give it, but after that I will get up and say that I was forced to give a bribe. That small change of the law, I feel, would cut down on bribe giving, but that turned out to be politically so controversial and people misunderstood the argument. So I still think that's a good idea, but it never got accepted.
Well, it's a pity because it's simple, but I don't know how it can be misinterpreted, but it's a real pity that that didn't get implemented into practice. But maybe one day. But well,
maybe one day, yeah.
But well, how did your years in government and the World Bank really change you as an economist and academic and also as a person?
As a person, I like to believe that it really hasn't changed me. I'm fundamentally very similar, but I can tell you there's one thing which has come into me. As a researcher, and this I say in my diary, I did not go into the world of research in order to make the world a better place, as some people say. I have to confess that for me, research is like the pursuit of beauty. It's like music. It's like art. I find looking at the world, looking for patterns, just a very, very exciting activity like the creation of music or art. And that is what had driven me into research. And most of my research career has been that pursuit of that kind of pattern and beauty. And when I came into the world of policymaking, I actually for a moment paused and said that in many ways, I don't think I was doing bad things, but I was doing like creating music, just doing it for the sake of that. When I came into the world of policymaking, I felt that I've spent too many years doing that. As a policymaker, my intention should be nothing but trying to deliver some benefit to the world. And I do take the view, I was India's chief economic advisor, but at one important level, it's a small world. And all of us have a shared responsibility for the full world. And we must all, wherever we are located, whatever our individual identity, we must keep the larger ambition of the world, our future generations together in mind. That, I have to say, I became much more conscious when I went into the policy world, and even having come back now into research, I try to keep that frontally in front of me as research and tell myself, yes, research is fun, but the fun must be combined with something important.
And I think that conviction you have that definitely translates onto those pages of your book, and it's moving, it's touching, and well, I think everyone should read it. And well, this is where we must end the interview today. That was Professor Kaushik Basu at Cornell University and former chief economist to the World Bank, and the author of Policymakers Journal. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.
And to our viewers, as always, thank you very much for watching.